Across the vastness of the world's oceans, ships have long vanished without explanation, but stranger still are those that return quietly adrift, intact yet completely empty. No distress calls, no lifeboats, no footprints on deck, just meals left half prepared, logbooks stopped mid-sentence, and engines humming with no hand at the helm. These are not tales passed down through rumor, but events documented in maritime records, found floating far from their intended course. Each vessel tells of a journey interrupted, with no sign of where the people went or why they left. The sea offers no explanations, only silence and the faint echoes of what once was. The ghost ship Mary Celeste, a journey without witness. On December 4, 1872, the brigantine Mary Celeste was found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 400 miles east of the Azores. The crew of the British ship Dei Gratia spotted her in the early morning light. Her sails were partially set, though in poor condition. The ship was moving slowly, without a clear course. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia recognized the vessel. He had spoken with its captain, Benjamin Briggs, just days before both ships left port in New York. The Mary Celeste had departed on November 7th, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. She never reached her destination. The sight was strange. The sea was calm. The ship was not capsized. Morehouse ordered a small boarding party to investigate. What they found has remained one of the great maritime mysteries. There was no one on deck, no signs of struggle. The lifeboat was missing. The ship's wheel was unattended. Below deck, the crew's belongings remained untouched. Meals sat half prepared. The galley was in order. Personal effects, including clothing, instruments, and the captain's cabin items, were undisturbed. But there was no crew, no passengers, no explanation. The ship's last entry in its logbook was dated November 25th. It recorded a routine position near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The entry gave no indication of distress. Weather had been reported calm. There were no reports of storms from nearby vessels. The logbook ended without ceremony. From that point forward, silence. Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 had vanished. 10 people in total. Gone. No remains were ever found. The ship's condition did not suggest a catastrophe. It had taken on some water, but it was not sinking. The pumps appeared recently used. A makeshift sounding rod had been left nearby, indicating someone had checked the water level. The hatch covers were secure. The cargo hold remained mostly intact, though 9 barrels, those made of red oak, were later found to be empty. Red oak is more porous than white oak, often used for barrels, and this detail would later fuel theories of vapor leakage. In Gibraltar, where the Mary Celeste was brought for investigation, authorities puzzled over the case. The court convened an inquiry under the supervision of Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General. He suspected foul play, but no evidence of violence, piracy, or mutiny was found. The ship was seaworthy. The cargo was largely intact. The value of the alcohol remained high. No valuables had been taken. The official report offered no final explanation. Speculation began almost immediately. Some believed the crew panicked over an imagined threat, such as fumes from the leaking alcohol. They may have feared an explosion and evacuated temporarily, only for their boat to become separated from the Mary Celeste. Others suggested a seaquake or underwater volcanic activity near the Azores. Some mentioned waterspouts, known to occur in that part of the Atlantic. Another theory pointed to contaminated flour or ergot poisoning, causing hallucinations and irrational behavior. None of these ideas could be confirmed. No physical evidence was found to support them. The crew's disappearance was clean, uneventful, and complete. One unusual detail was that the ship's chronometer, sextant, and navigation book were gone. These would have been taken if the crew had left voluntarily. Yet, there was no reason to abandon the ship in such calm waters. With food stores intact and no sign of damage, Captain Briggs was experienced and conservative in judgment. He had previously commanded other voyages without incident. His wife Sarah had only joined him because he considered the journey safe. Their daughter Sophia was known to be in good health. The first mate, Albert G. Richardson, was handpicked by Briggs. The rest of the crew had no known grievances or history of disorder. There were no reports of disease or injury among them when they departed. Years later, the story of the Mary Celeste would grow in the telling. In 1884, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a fictionalized account titled J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement. It was published anonymously in Cornhill magazine. The story changed names and added sinister details: murder, madness, conspiracy. Many readers believed it was a true account. The fiction blurred into the facts. Newspapers reprinted Doyle's version as if it were genuine. The confusion helped turn the Mary Celeste into a cultural myth. In reality, the ship had a long and troubled history. Originally named the Amazon, it was built in Nova Scotia in 1861. Its first captain died during the maiden voyage. It struck a fishing dam and later collided with a brig in the English Channel. After running aground in 1867, it was salvaged, sold, and renamed. The renaming, some later claimed, had cursed the ship. This belief, though unsupported, clung to the story. After the Gibraltar inquiry, the Mary Celeste resumed service under different owners. It changed hands multiple times. In 1885, her final voyage ended off the coast of Haiti. The ship was intentionally wrecked by her captain Gilman Parker in an insurance fraud scheme. Parker was charged with conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, but was not convicted. He died less than a year later, reportedly in disgrace. Other participants in the fraud also suffered misfortunes, adding to the ship's aura of doom. The case of the Mary Celeste has resisted explanation for over 150 years. Its uniqueness lies in the combination of facts: an intact ship, a calm sea, no signs of struggle, and a vanished crew. Unlike other ghost ships found wrecked or storm-battered, this one had simply continued without its people. It had no clear reason to be abandoned. No bodies were found, no messages left behind. It was a ship without a story, drifting slowly under its own power until found. Many theories have been proposed. None are proven. The disappearance has remained a fixed point in maritime mystery, referenced in books, documentaries, and lectures. Over time, small embellishments entered the narrative. Stories of bloodied swords, torn clothing, and unsealed food appeared. But the original records from 1872 are plain and unremarkable. They note a ship, empty but intact, drifting toward the open Atlantic. In maritime law, abandoning a seaworthy vessel without just cause is nearly unheard of. Sailors are trained to remain with their ships unless in imminent danger. The Mary Celeste had food, water, working sails, and a solid hull. If danger had existed, it left no trace. There have been other ghost ships: the MV Joyita in 1955, the SS Beichimo in 1931, the Carroll A. Deering in 1921. Each one left behind empty decks and unanswered questions. But none captured the imagination quite like the Mary Celeste. Perhaps because it was the first in an era of modern journalism. Perhaps because the mystery remains entirely unsolved. The Atlantic continues to carry ships across the same routes. The Azores still mark the midpoint between continents. But the people of the Mary Celeste were never found. Their names remain recorded. Their cabins left undisturbed. Their journey stopped, not by wind or storm, but by silence. Even now, the name Mary Celeste has become shorthand for unexplained absences, for quiet disappearances, for vessels that return without explanation, for movements across oceans that begin with certainty and with nothing. The Carroll A. Deering, a silent grounding on Diamond Shoals. On January 31, 1921, the five-masted schooner Carroll A. Deering was found aground on the shallow waters of Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The ship stood upright, its hull battered by the surf but largely intact. Its sails were still set. From a distance, it appeared as if the crew had simply gone below for rest. But when the Coast Guard arrived aboard the cutter Manning 2 days later, they found the vessel deserted. The lifeboats were missing. The ship's log, navigation equipment, and personal belongings of the officers were gone. The crew, consisting of 10 men, had vanished without explanation. The Carroll A. Deering was a modern sailing ship for its time. Built in Bath, Maine in 1919, the schooner was designed to carry bulk cargo like coal and lumber. On its final voyage, it had been transporting a load of coal from Puerto Rico to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The captain originally assigned to the vessel had fallen ill shortly before departure. He was replaced by Captain W. B. Warmell, a seasoned but aging mariner. His first mate was Charles B. McClellan, a man with whom Warmell would soon have problems. After delivering the coal to Brazil, the ship departed for Portland, Maine to resupply. On the return trip north, the schooner made several sightings. On January 28th, the ship was spotted near Cape Lookout Lightship by its keeper, Captain Jacobson. Jacobson later reported that the crew aboard the Deering had acted oddly. A man with a foreign accent, whom Jacobson did not recognize as the captain, shouted through a megaphone that the vessel had lost its anchors. He asked the lightship to report this to the ship's owners in New York. Captain Warmell, known for being careful and precise, was not seen. This unusual request and the fact that the man speaking was not the captain raised concern. 2 days later, the Carroll A. Deering was found run aground on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The Diamond Shoals are known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Hundreds of ships have met their end on those shifting sandbars. But the Deering did not appear to have wrecked in a storm. The weather had been fair. The ship had run aground at full sail, suggesting it was under control until the very last moment. Inside the vessel, investigators noted that the galley had food prepared, as if a meal had been interrupted. Bunks were unmade. No signs of fire or violence were found. Charts and navigation tools were missing. The ship's wheel was unmanned. All lifeboats were gone. but the ship's hull was intact, and the cargo hold was still full of coal. The mystery deepened when the ship's logbook and other vital documents were never recovered. The last confirmed sighting of the Deering was by the lightship, and after that, no messages were received. Several days later, the ship was on the shoals, deserted. There were no distress calls, no flares, no wreckage apart from the grounded vessel. The crew had vanished completely. In the months following the discovery, the US government launched an investigation involving the Departments of Commerce, Justice, and the Navy. Dozens of theories were considered. One idea was that a mutiny had occurred. Reports suggested that Captain Warmel and First Mate McClellan had argued in Rio. Warmel had dismissed McClellan after a drunken outburst, only to reinstate him later. Some speculated that the crew may have turned against their captain, but no physical evidence of a struggle was found on the ship. Another theory involved piracy. Prohibition was in effect at the time, and the Atlantic coast was busy with rum-running operations. Some investigators believed the Deering may have encountered illegal operations and been forcibly taken. Yet, the cargo of coal had no value to smugglers, and nothing on board had been looted. A third explanation pointed to weather. While no storms were reported during the ship's final days, sudden squalls were not uncommon in the region. A storm could have frightened the crew into abandoning ship, but abandoning a seaworthy ship near the coast with no immediate danger was not standard maritime practice. Lifeboats had limited range, and no remains or wreckage from the lifeboats were ever found. The FBI even considered sabotage by communist groups. A series of vessel disappearances around the same time led to theories that a coordinated effort was underway to disrupt American shipping. In the months surrounding the Deering's stranding, several other ships had been reported missing under unclear circumstances. The U.S. consul in Rio had previously reported concerns about radical elements among dockworkers, but these ideas lacked concrete evidence and were eventually dropped. One of the more unusual theories involved the Bermuda Triangle. Though the term had not yet been coined, the idea that ships were disappearing in a defined region of the Atlantic gained attention in later decades. The Deering's final route skirted areas that would later be associated with unexplained vanishings. But in 1921, no one had yet popularized this idea, and no scientific basis supported it. Eventually, the government closed the case without a definitive conclusion. The ship was considered a total loss. Because of the dangerous position of the wreck on the shoals, the Carroll A. Deering was dynamited and destroyed in March 1921. Its remains were scattered across the sands. No trace of the crew or lifeboats was ever recovered. In the years that followed, the Deering became part of American maritime law. Its sudden grounding, missing crew, and odd last communication from a non-captain figure made it stand out. Though less globally famous than the Mary Celeste, the Deering was more modern, larger, and part of a more complex geopolitical moment. Unlike many ghost ships, it had been observed just days before grounding, under suspicious conditions. The logbook was never found. The anchors, mentioned as missing in the final sighting, were also not located. Captain Warmel's widow insisted that her husband would never have left the ship under such conditions. She maintained that something unnatural had taken place. No one could explain why a working ship, with food ready and no storm present, would be left in such a state. The surrounding region, Cape Hatteras and the Diamond Shoals, remained dangerous long after. Even with modern navigation, the sands shift unpredictably. The Carroll A. Deering joined the long list of vessels that met their end there, but few others did so with such eerie silence. A ship found without damage, a meal abandoned, a captain not seen during the final communication, a wheel unmanned, lifeboats gone, and no word ever received. The sea does not explain these moments. It only presents the result. The Carol A. Deering continues to appear in records and discussions. Its photographs taken from the beach show a full-rigged vessel still standing, as if waiting, as if paused. A ship meant for trade, grounded in shallow water, with no one to claim it. The waves continued, the sands shifted, and the ship was removed, but the absence it left behind has remained. The MV Joyita, found drifting, crew never seen again. On November 10, 1955, the merchant vessel MV Joyita was discovered adrift in the South Pacific. She was found northeast of Vanuatu, Fiji, far off her intended course. The vessel was partially submerged, listing sharply to port. Her hull showed no signs of collision or fire. But she was abandoned. There was no crew, no passengers, no lifeboats. The radio was present, but had been tampered with. A doctor's bag with blood-stained bandages was found. 25 people had set sail. None were ever seen again. The Joyita had departed from Apia Harbor in Western Samoa on October 3, 1955. Her destination was the Tokelau Islands, a routine trip of about 270 nautical miles. The voyage was expected to take 2 days. The ship, a 69-foot wooden vessel, was under the command of Captain Thomas Dusty Miller. He was well known in the region, experienced, methodical, and confident. Alongside him were a crew of 16 and 9 passengers, including a New Zealand physician named Dr. Alfred Parsons. The ship was loaded with cargo, medical supplies, food, barrels of oil, and mailbags. The Joyita had suffered mechanical issues before. One of her 2 engines was not functioning at departure. Captain Miller chose to sail with only 1 working engine. It slowed the vessel, but he believed the weather was calm enough to proceed. No records suggest he anticipated danger. He was known to be cautious, not reckless. The ship never arrived in the Tokelau. Concern grew. By October 6th, a full search and rescue operation was launched. Planes from Fiji and New Zealand scanned the region. Surface vessels were deployed. No debris was found. No signals had been received. The seas remained quiet. Eventually, the search was called off. Then, 37 days later, a merchant ship spotted the Joyita near Vanuatu. She was floating low in the water, tilted heavily. Barnacles covered her hull well above the usual waterline, indicating she had been adrift for weeks. Her deck was flooded, but the hull had not broken. Investigators noted that the vessel, built with cork-lined compartments, was considered unsinkable by design. Even with water damage, she had stayed afloat. When officials boarded the ship, they found a puzzling scene. The wheelhouse was empty. The controls were set to a steady course, but the compass was broken. Charts were missing. The radio was present but disabled. Wires connecting it to the antenna had been deliberately cut. A tangle of wires hung from the overhead. The logbook was gone. So were the ship's log chronometer, sextant, and most of the navigational tools. All 3 life rafts were absent. The galley showed signs of disuse. Cups sat half-filled. A pot of stew had spoiled. The refrigerator was open and empty. Several cans of food in the hold were split open, likely from heat exposure. The medical kit was found with bandages stained in dried blood. Nearby, a pair of men's shoes were discovered on deck. There were no bodies. In the cabins, personal belongings of the crew and passengers had been left behind. Clothes hung in lockers. Blankets were still folded on beds. There were no signs of a struggle, no bullet holes, no fire damage, no indication of theft. The mailbags were unopened. Barrels of oil remained. Yet something had triggered everyone on board to leave. In Suva, an official investigation was opened. The board found that the engine room was in disarray. One engine remained inoperable. The functional engine had been running at some point, but its clutch had failed. This would have left the Joyita dead in the water. The bilge pumps were clogged with debris. Several bulkheads had been damaged. Still, the vessel floated. Investigators also noted the peculiar state of the radio. The ship's main transmission wire had been intentionally cut. This rendered the radio useless. The crew may not have realized the wire had been severed. They would have assumed their distress signals were being sent. Captain Miller, reportedly a competent operator, would have expected a response. The absence of replies might have led to panic. The sea conditions on October 3rd and the days following were not extreme, but reports suggest intermittent squalls may have occurred. The ship's slow speed, due to the single engine, would have made her vulnerable to currents. It is possible she was pushed far off course, without power or communication. One theory proposed that the ship began to take on water. With a disabled bilge pump and one engine out, the crew may have feared sinking. But abandoning a vessel like the Joyita built not to sink goes against standard maritime training. Captain Miller would have been aware of her buoyancy. The decision to leave must have involved other pressures. Some suggest a medical emergency. The doctor's bag and bloody bandages imply someone had been injured. Dr. Parsons may have attempted treatment. If the injured person was the captain or radio operator, the crew may have become disoriented. Fear, combined with radio silence and mechanical failure, may have caused them to believe the ship was doomed. The missing lifeboats were never recovered. No wreckage from them was found. No bodies ever washed ashore. The Pacific currents are wide and erratic. A lifeboat leaving the Joyita in panic may have drifted into deep ocean, never seen again. The investigation offered no answers. Alternative theories emerged. Some suggested piracy, though the region was not known for it at the time. There was no missing cargo. Others believed the crew may have encountered smugglers or even foreign fishing vessels operating illegally, but the evidence was absent. No witnesses, no reports. Captain Miller's reputation was scrutinized. Friends and colleagues described him as stubborn but capable. He had survived shipwrecks before. His refusal to delay departure despite engine issues was questioned. Still, nothing in his past indicated a tendency toward poor judgment or panic. The final report of the inquiry offered a technical explanation. It cited the engine failure, disabled radio, and accumulation of water. But it could not explain the absence of bodies or why the crew chose to leave. The report's conclusion, abandonment due to fear of sinking, remained unsatisfying. After repairs, the Joyita was returned to service. But her reputation was tainted. Sailors avoided her. Owners changed frequently. By the 1960s, she was decommissioned and left to decay. Eventually, she was dismantled. Only photographs, scattered parts, and witness accounts remain. The MV Joyita joined the list of maritime mysteries. Ships found adrift, crews missing, logs absent. Unlike 19th century ghost ships, the Joyita had modern technology: radios, engines, navigation tools. Her disappearance occurred during peacetime, under watchful skies. Yet, 25 people vanished. No trace, no farewell, no evidence. They left behind only silence and a vessel that refused to sink. To this day, the Joyita remains one of the Pacific's most enduring enigmas. She was built to carry people and supplies across calm waters, but instead, she returned alone, wounded, waterlogged, and mute. A ship with no witnesses. A voyage without return. The Kaz II, drifting catamaran and the vanishing crew. On April 18, 2007, a white catamaran named Kaz II was discovered drifting off the coast of Australia. The vessel was sighted near the outer edges of the Great Barrier Reef, approximately 160 kilometers off Townsville. From the air, nothing seemed wrong. The sails were up. The boat looked intact. A helicopter from the Queensland Emergency Management Office made a routine flyover after local authorities reported the yacht was overdue. It was then that the first signs of something strange appeared. The boat seemed to be circling slowly. No one was seen on deck. No radio replies came. When the rescue team boarded the next day, they found a scene that has since become one of the most puzzling maritime disappearances in recent history. Inside the Kaz II, food sat uneaten on the table. A laptop was still switched on. A newspaper dated April 15th rested beside it. One of the crew's mobile phones sat near the helm. The engine was running. Navigation systems were operational. Life jackets were accounted for. Nothing had been tampered with. But the three men who had set out, Derek Batten, 56, and brothers Peter and James Tunstead, aged 69 and 63, were gone. No sign of a struggle, no distress signal had been sent. The ship, it seemed, had been abandoned under calm conditions and for no obvious reason. The Kaz II had departed from Airlie Beach on April 15th, intending to sail north to Townsville, a journey of roughly 500 kilometers. The men, all from Perth, were described as close friends and hobbyist sailors. Derek Batten was the boat's owner and the most experienced of the three. James and Peter Tunstead were described by relatives as practical and safety-minded. They had stocked the vessel with supplies and had even undergone basic maritime training in preparation for the trip. Nothing in their planning suggested carelessness. The Kaz II was a recently purchased vessel, a 9.8-meter catamaran outfitted with modern electronics and dual engines. It had 2 radios, GPS, depth sounder, and all standard safety gear. The catamaran design gave it greater stability than single-hull boats. They had prepared their route. The weather forecast was favorable. They were in no hurry. The plan was to sail during the day, anchor overnight, and take their time along the coast. The last known communication from the Kaz II came on the afternoon of their departure. A passing vessel received a brief VHF radio message. Nothing unusual was reported, no mention of trouble or mechanical failure. Then, silence. The boat was not reported missing immediately. Only when it failed to arrive in Townsville did authorities begin to investigate. When the vessel was discovered 3 days later, it was adrift near the outer reef. The sea conditions were mild, winds had been light. Investigators were quickly dispatched. Upon boarding, they noted that the sails were partially unfurled, though one was torn. The sail damage did not appear recent. The boat's fenders were still deployed, which is uncommon once at sea. This suggested that the men may not have properly secured the vessel for sailing, or that they had been interrupted. There was no indication of flooding. The bilge pumps were functioning. The deck was tidy. The cabin door was open. There were no broken railings, no blood, no signs of forced entry. The coroner's inquest, held months later, included testimony from maritime experts, forensic analysts, and family members. The report examined each item found aboard. One key detail emerged. The yacht's GPS showed that it had traveled in slow circles for hours after losing course. No course corrections had been made. The engine, engaged during this time, had been left running without intervention. The electronic systems indicated that nobody had touched the controls since sometime on April 16th. Photos taken from the vessel's onboard camera showed the three men enjoying themselves earlier in the journey. In one image, Peter Tunstead is seen at the helm, smiling. Another shows James Tunstead fishing off the stern. Derek Batten appears relaxed, seated near the console. These photos are time-stamped within hours of the last known contact. There is no sign of stress, no indication that anything was wrong. One theory put forward by investigators was that a fishing mishap triggered a chain of events. Suppose one man, perhaps James, hooked something large and leaned too far over. He may have been pulled into the water. Another, seeing the incident, could have dived in to help. The third, attempting a rescue or dropping the sails, may have also fallen overboard. The yacht, with its engine still engaged and autopilot on, would have continued to drift. This theory was considered the most plausible, but it had problems. None of the life jackets were missing. The yacht's lifebuoy was also still in place. In a man-overboard scenario, it would be standard practice to throw flotation devices. No such attempt seemed to have been made. The missing crew's families expressed doubt about the official theory. They believed that the men were too cautious to behave so carelessly. They would not have all left the helm without securing the boat. They would not have failed to radio for help. They had safety training. Derek Batten, in particular, was known to double-check his equipment before departure. Their families pointed out that even if two men had gone overboard, the third would almost certainly have remained aboard to coordinate a rescue or call for assistance. But no such effort appeared to have been made. No evidence of piracy or foul play was ever found. The vessel was not looted. Valuables, including wallets, mobile phones, and electronic equipment, were left untouched. Nothing suggested external interference. The surrounding waters, near the reef, were not considered dangerous in terms of criminal activity. There were no known reports of illegal vessels in the area at the time. Radar records showed no nearby traffic that could have intercepted the boat. Weather data showed light winds and scattered clouds during the voyage. No squalls, no sudden changes in pressure or visibility. The reef system can be unpredictable, but experienced sailors are generally aware of its patterns. The catamaran had no grounding damage. The hull was intact. The engines were operational. All this ruled out most environmental explanations. The Queensland coroner ultimately concluded that the men had drowned in a tragic accident, likely after one fell overboard and the others followed in a failed rescue attempt. But the case remains officially unsolved. The vessel was returned to the Batten family. The disappearance of its crew has become part of maritime history. The Cas-2's story echoes older sea mystery ships that return intact but unmanned. Unlike 19th century sailing vessels, this was a modern boat with communications, power, and GPS. Yet those systems could not prevent 3 experienced men from vanishing silently, without a single message sent. Today, the Kaz-2 is remembered for its unsettling stillness. A working boat, food untouched, coffee cooling, the door open, the sea calm, a fishing line gently dragging in the water, and nothing else. The men did not return. Their bodies were never recovered. The boat drifted onward, without explanation, without closure, without a sound. The SV Bellamica, a ghost yacht with no origin. On August 24, 2006, a sleek sailing vessel was discovered adrift near Punta Volpe, on the northeastern coast of Sardinia, Italy. A passing Italian Coast Guard patrol noticed the boat, unmoving, in calm water, with no one visible on deck. The sails were partly furled, there was no flag. The name painted on the stern was Belle Amica. The type of vessel was unfamiliar to local authorities. It resembled a vintage schooner, but was built with modern lines and equipment. When they boarded, they found the boat in excellent condition, except for one detail. It was completely abandoned. Inside the cabin, investigators found an open French-language map of North African seas, a pile of clothes, some French literature, and a half-eaten meal still on the table gave the impression that whoever had been aboard had left quickly. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken instruments, no distress beacon had been activated. The navigation equipment was working. The food in the galley was fresh. The weather had been calm in the region for days. The ship had no registration documents on board, no AIS transmitter, no call sign on file. The sails were trimmed properly, indicating it had been under control before being left. A laptop computer was located in the main cabin. It was switched off, no passwords. The language of its interface was set to French. Photographs and notes found aboard also suggested a French-speaking occupant, but there was no sign of any person. At first, authorities suspected the vessel had been used in smuggling. The Mediterranean, particularly the stretch between North Africa and southern Europe, has long been a corridor for both legal and illegal passage. But the Belle Amica carried no contraband. There were no unusual modifications to its hold. Its construction materials were high-end. It was not a converted fishing boat or cargo vessel. It appeared to be a privately owned yacht, possibly custom-built. Its unusual design made classification difficult. It combined classic lines with modern fixtures. Authorities noted that it resembled a 19th-century schooner, but had modern fiberglass inlays and electronics. After several days of public speculation, a man named Franck Rouet-Roux came forward. He was a French citizen residing in Luxembourg. Rouet-Roux claimed to be the vessel's owner. According to his statement, he had anchored the yacht offshore and gone ashore by dinghy to resolve an urgent personal matter. He had not informed the Italian Coast Guard, he said, because he believed the boat would remain safe in open waters. Italian authorities accepted the explanation, but issued a fine for failing to report the vessel's presence. Rouet-Roux presented papers that confirmed ownership. The yacht, however, had never been officially registered with any maritime authority. In most countries, vessels of that size are required to be documented. The Belle Amica had no home port listed on its hull. Rouet-Roux admitted this was an oversight. Despite the apparent resolution, many details remained unclear. Rouet-Roux had not filed a travel plan or notified any coastal authority of his voyage. He could not provide a clear answer about why the vessel had no national markings. When asked why he had left the ship unmanned and adrift, he gave conflicting timelines. At one point, he claimed he had left only hours earlier. But food found on board was partly decayed. Experts believed it had been prepared at least 48 hours before discovery. Some observers questioned whether the man's story aligned with the condition of the ship. It was found with navigational instruments on. Fresh provisions still on the table. A laptop powered off, but left in plain view. If he had planned to leave temporarily, why was no anchor set? The boat was adrift, not moored. Currents near Punta Volpe are mild, but the vessel had drifted close to rocks. Had it not been spotted by the Coast Guard, it could have run aground. Media outlets across Europe picked up the story. The image of a perfectly preserved yacht floating in silence, with no crew and a meal untouched, captured public imagination. It was soon nicknamed the ghost ship of the Mediterranean. Despite official explanations, online forums and newspapers speculated on alternative possibilities. Some wondered if the ship had been used for espionage. Others suggested it had been abandoned due to criminal activity. A few compared it to the Mary Celeste's iconic 19th century brigantine, found empty in the Atlantic, its crew never found. But the Bella Amica lacked some of the dramatic circumstances of older maritime mysteries. There was no sign of foul play, no suggestion of mutiny, no indications of piracy. There were no missing passengers, no reports of distress calls. And Rouerou, after paying his fine, returned to Luxembourg and declined further comment. What remained then was a modern ghost ship, whose only mystery was why it had been left to drift. In later months, yacht spotters and naval experts reviewed the ship's specifications. They found no record of its build in known registries. Its dimensions, sail configuration, and equipment did not match any commercially manufactured model. Some concluded it was a one-off design, possibly built in a private European shipyard. Rouerou never confirmed where the vessel had been constructed. The cost of such a custom yacht would have been considerable, yet there was no record of its purchase or commissioning in Luxembourg or France. Its name Belle Amica means beautiful friend in Italianized French. The spelling was odd. Amica is not a French word. It resembled a blend of languages, perhaps deliberate. No prior vessels with that name existed in registries. No maritime traffic had reported its movements prior to discovery. The boat had not passed through any major harbors or ports with inspection procedures. In maritime law, vessels over a certain length must register with a national authority and display identification. The Belle Amica had no such markings. This absence raised additional questions about its previous voyages. Had it avoided ports altogether? Had it stayed offshore for extended periods, refueling and provisioning from private docks? The incident was closed in administrative records. But amateur researchers and sailing communities continued to investigate. Satellite photos from that week showed no other vessels in the area at the time the Belle Amica was found. Wind and current models suggested the ship had drifted slowly for nearly 2 days. This contradicted the timeline given by Rouerou. No missing person reports were filed in relation to the yacht. No insurance claims were made. No ports of departure were documented. The Belle Amica, in official terms, became just another maritime irregularity. But its details remain curious. It was a ship found in perfect shape. No malfunction, no weather event, no theft, no graffiti or vandalism. Electronics working. Navigation gear present. Meals left, as if interrupted. A French owner who departed without alert. A boat with no registration, no flag, and no past. Unlike storm-wrecked derelicts or abandoned cargo ships, the Bella Mica had style. Its appearance suggested a floating home or retreat. Yet the absence of evidence, when combined with the owner's vague answers, made observers uneasy. Vessels of that kind do not usually travel unmonitored. They are expensive to build, trackable by satellite, and of interest to port authorities. But the Bella Mica passed unseen until it neared land. For 2 days it floated near Sardinia's shore, sails slack, without colliding with other vessels or reefs. It was found by chance. And then it left no further trace. Years later, references to the Bella Mica continue to appear in maritime compilations and unexplained incident catalogues. It is often listed alongside better-known cases like the MV Joyita or the Kaz II, though its story is simpler. It is not marked by tragedy. No one was lost, no mayday was received. But the clean abandon, the near-perfect condition, and the silence remain unsettling. A yacht appears. A man claims ownership. The boat has no flag, no registration. A half-eaten meal sits waiting, and then the owner walks away, giving no details, and is never asked again. The sea offers few explanations for stillness. Ships like the Bella Mica are not forgotten because of what they debut, because of how quietly they do it. Not with disaster, but with absence. In a world of constant data, this vessel had none. No documents, no logs, no call sign, only drift, only discovery, only unanswered questions. The Bella Mica left no trail but for a moment. It drifted at the surface, quiet, complete, and alone. The High Aim 6, the fishing vessel that returned alone. On January 8, 2003, the Australian customs vessel MV Southern Supporter encountered a fishing boat drifting off the northwest coast of Australia, near Rowley Shoals. The vessel, named High Aim 6, showed no signs of distress. It was floating calmly in open water. Its engine was running. But when the boarding party arrived, they found no one aboard. No captain, no crew, just a fully operational longliner adrift in silence. The High Aim 6 was a Taiwanese fishing vessel registered to Taichung, Taiwan. It had last departed on December 31, 2002, from the port of Shaogang, Kaohsiung. The ship was headed toward Indonesian waters, crewed by one Taiwanese captain and a team of 11 Indonesian fishermen. Their destination was known. The route was standard. But in the second week of January, the ship was thousands of kilometers off course. What puzzled authorities was the condition of the vessel. On board, the crew's personal items remained in place. Clothes were hung neatly in quarters. Wallets, shoes, and identification documents were present. Food supplies were stocked. Fuel levels were normal. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the ship's exterior. The GPS was functioning. The navigation systems were online. One of the vessel's 2 lifeboats was missing. The other remained on its mount. Taiwanese officials were contacted. The vessel's owners had not received any distress signals. The satellite phone, though still on board, had not been used since January 2nd. The last known communication was a call placed by the captain to the ship's owners. He had reported calm seas and routine fishing conditions. After that, all contact stopped. Australian authorities towed the vessel to Broome for closer inspection. Investigators began examining the High Aim 6 for any trace of the missing crew. None of the 11 men were found. There were no footprints on deck, indicating a fight, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry to the cabins. A medical kit remained unused. The ship's catch several tons of tuna was still stored in the hold. The longline gear had been deployed and was partially reeled in, as if the work had been interrupted mid-task. Some believed the crew had abandoned the ship voluntarily, but there was no evidence of weather conditions severe enough to require evacuation. The sea had been calm. The weather reports for the area showed no cyclonic activity. Moreover, abandoning a perfectly seaworthy ship with ample supplies and a working engine made little sense. Taiwan dispatched investigators to Australia to examine the vessel. They noted that the wiring to the engine's radio antenna had been deliberately cut. This indicated that someone on board had disabled external communications. The satellite phone remained functional, but had not been used after January 2nd. Its battery was low, but not dead. Another unusual detail came from the food stores. Several packages of instant noodles were missing. In the sleeping quarters, investigators noted that one bed appeared to have been slept in more recently than the others. This suggested that someone may have remained aboard after the others disappeared. Then, in February, a breakthrough came from Indonesia. Authorities there apprehended a man named Muhammad Saeed, one of the High Aim 6's Indonesian crew members. He was found in a remote village in East Java. After questioning, he admitted to being part of the vessel's crew. He stated that a mutiny had taken place on board. According to Saeed, the Indonesian crew had grown angry at the captain and chief engineer. The reasons were vague, possibly disputes over pay or treatment. Saeed claimed that both the Taiwanese officers were killed. The bodies, he said, were thrown overboard. Afterward, most of the crew took one of the lifeboats and returned to Indonesia. Saeed himself said he had flown home. How he managed to get from the middle of the ocean to a remote village without documentation was not clarified. Authorities were skeptical of his account. He provided little detail. No other crew members were found. No additional confessions. No forensics on the High Aim 6 supported a violent mutiny. There were no bloodstains, no weapons found, no signs of struggle in the captain's quarters or in engineering compartments. The only physical anomaly remained the cut radio cable. The theory of mutiny persisted, but without corroborating evidence, investigators could not prove it. The location where the bodies were allegedly disposed was never identified. No bodies were recovered. No arrests were made beyond Saeed's brief detention. He was eventually released and returned to his village. Taiwanese authorities closed the case without resolution. The High Aim 6 was eventually returned to Taiwan. Its owner stated that the financial loss was secondary to the mystery of what had happened to his crew. Families of the missing fishermen received no answers. With no evidence of violence, no signs of natural disaster, and no radio calls for help, the event was filed as unexplained. Some maritime analysts proposed alternative theories. One possibility was that an accidental death, perhaps of the captain, had led to confusion and abandonment. Another suggested the crew might have been rescued or picked up by another vessel after some mechanical failure, but these ideas did not align with the known facts. The ship was functional. The weather had been calm. Its course showed no signs of erratic movement. Satellite tracking indicated that the High Aim 6 had been drifting slowly for more than a week before it was discovered. The engine had been left idling. The autopilot was still engaged. The direction of drift suggested it had been deserted sometime between January 3rd and January 5th. But exact timing was impossible to determine. The incident drew comparisons to the CAS-2 case, which occurred 4 years later in Australia. Both involved vessels found drifting in good condition, with food prepared, systems operational, and no crew. Both generated interest for their calm, clinical nature disappearances without noise or explanation. Unlike 19th century ghost ships, these modern cases lacked storm damage or pirate attacks. They occurred in known waters, with up-to-date technology and equipment, and yet, in both instances, the ocean returned the vessel but not its people. The High Aim 6 now remains a footnote in maritime records, often referenced in discussions of unexplained sea disappearances. One man claimed murder. No bodies were found, no charges filed. A fishing ship built for daily work left its last voyage without answers. Ships vanish in storms, in war, or through error. But sometimes they do not vanish. They return quietly without those who guided them. The High Aim 6 drifted ashore, holding only fuel, fish, and silence. No log entry, no final word, just drift. The Jianseng, a rusting hull with no name and no crew. On March 24, 2006, a routine surveillance flight by the Australian Customs Service spotted an unfamiliar vessel drifting in the Gulf of Carpentaria. The ship was located about 180 kilometers southwest of Weipa, Queensland. It had no visible name, no flag, no identification markings of any kind. The vessel was not emitting any distress signals. It was floating listlessly in calm water. Days later, when the Customs patrol vessel Storm Bay reached it, they found a large, rusted, and completely abandoned tanker. It would become known as the Jianseng. From a distance, the ship appeared neglected. Paint peeled from its hull, parts of the superstructure were damaged, but it was afloat, not listing, and did not appear to have suffered any recent impact. When the boarding team stepped onto the deck, there was no one to greet them. No crew, no signs of life, not even a dog or bird. It was silent. The vessel's engines were non-functional. Its generator was not running. There were no lights. It had clearly not been under power for a long time. Inside, the situation grew stranger. The ship carried no cargo, but in the hold were large quantities of rice, mostly spoiled, stored in torn sacks. There was no paperwork explaining the cargo, no bill of lading, no shipping documentation. There were no charts, logs, or ship records. Navigation systems had been removed or stripped for parts. The wheelhouse was in disrepair. The kitchen was empty. The living quarters were stripped of personal items. No passports, no photos, no clothing. The only remaining features were worn furnishings and broken equipment. The vessel had no visible registration. It did not appear in any international maritime databases. Its IMO number had been painted over or removed. The name Jianseng was later attributed to the ship by Australian authorities, who found a faint marking on a life buoy among the scattered debris on deck. But the origin of that name could not be traced to any current or previous shipping company. There were no records of a ship with that exact configuration under that name. Australian officials towed the vessel to Weipa. There, it was examined in detail by representatives from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, the Department of Immigration, and Australian Customs. They concluded that the ship had been adrift for weeks possibly months. The vessel was not seaworthy. Rust had eaten through much of the hull in spots. Its electrical systems were non-functional, but the fuel tanks were full. The rice stores were consistent with supplies typically used to sustain a working crew, not cargo for trade. No evidence of foul play was discovered. There were no signs of fire, blood, or forced entry. No indication of piracy. No distress calls had been sent. Officials theorized that the vessel had been used as a resupply ship for fishing fleets operating illegally in northern Australian waters. These support ships typically carry fuel, water, and food to remote areas, enabling smaller boats to remain at sea for extended periods. When such vessels reach the end of their service life, they are sometimes abandoned. The Jianseng, it was suggested, may have broken free of a tow line while being moved to a scrapping yard in South Asia. Or perhaps it had been purposely abandoned in international waters and drifted south into Australian territory. But no one came forward to claim ownership. No shipping company admitted responsibility. No port reported it missing. It had simply arrived uninvited and unexplained. The rice cargo, though unusual, supported the theory that the vessel had been used as a provisioning ship. Several similar cases had occurred in the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. In those situations, unflagged ships had been discovered operating in remote areas without crew documentation, avoiding port inspections and often violating fishing or labor laws. But most of those ships were identified. The Jianseng remained anonymous. Despite its rust and age, the vessel was large, about 80 meters long. The hull shape and internal structure indicated it had once been a fuel tanker. The engine room had been gutted. The engine block itself was heavily corroded. Toolboxes, once mounted on the walls, were missing. Wiring was stripped in places. It was likely scavenged for valuable components before abandonment. There was no trace of when the ship had last been crewed. No notes, no maintenance records, no food packaging with legible expiry dates. The rice in the hold had begun to rot. Rats were found on board, but no domestic animals. It was unclear how long it had been drifting, though experts believed it could have been adrift for several weeks without being noticed, due to the vastness of the Gulf and the relatively low traffic in that region. After inspection, Australian authorities determined the vessel was a navigational hazard. It had no functioning lights or transponders. If left alone, it might drift into shipping lanes or run aground on the northern coastline. With no owner to contact, no flag state to assume responsibility, and no port of origin to direct it to, the decision was made to destroy it. The Jianseng was towed offshore and scuttled in deep water under controlled conditions. Its story ended without ceremony. It had carried no crew, no cargo of value, and no information. But its arrival raised larger concerns. It highlighted the existence of abandoned vessels operating outside international law. Ghost ships with no registry, working for unlisted companies, serving illegal fleets far from port. The Jianseng was not the first such vessel found in the region. In the years that followed, other similar ships would be discovered in the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific, drifting silently or run aground on remote islands. Unlike the Mary Celeste or the Kaz II, the Jianseng offered no mystery in its moment of discovery. There was no half-eaten meal, no running engine, no personal effects. But it presented a different kind of puzzlier ghost ship, not from the past, but from a shadow fleet. A rusting hull without identity, yet clearly part of an unseen network of ships operating beyond the oversight of national and maritime regulations. The incident received limited coverage in the global press. Most outlets referred to it simply as an unidentified abandoned ship, a footnote, a curiosity. But in shipping and customs circles, it prompted internal discussions. If a vessel that large could enter Australian waters unnoticed, what else had already passed through? The Jiansang drifted quietly. It made no calls. It carried no message. No one looked for it. No one claimed it. It was simply founderment, unregistered and unwanted. It now joins a short but growing list of modern ghost ships. Unlike storm-wrecked schooners or yachts lost at sea, this was no accident. It had been abandoned by design, its final task unknown, its origin lost, its silence intentional. The ocean holds on to such thingshooks that carry no story but imply one. Ships that appear without names and vanish without records. The Jiansang left nothing behind but rust and questions. It had no beginning, no end, and no crew to ask. Only steel, drifting, until someone found it. The Beichimo, the ship that refused to sink. On October 1st, 1931, the Hudson's Bay Company cargo ship, Beichimo, became trapped in pack ice off the coast of Barrow, Alaska. The steel-hulled vessel had been on a routine trading voyage, collecting furs from Inuit trappers along the northern coast and exchanging them for supplies. The crew had encountered early sea ice while attempting to return to Vancouver. The ship was immobilized, locked in drifting sheets of ice before it could reach safety. What followed was not just a temporary delay but the beginning of a decades-long mystery. The Beichimo was a steel cargo steamer, 230 feet long, and powered by a triple expansion steam engine. Built in 1914 in Sweden under the name Ångermanälven, she was acquired by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921 and renamed. For 10 years, she sailed the Arctic route reliably, supplying remote communities in the Canadian North and collecting trade goods. In 1931, she set off as usual. But the weather that fall came early. The freeze set in faster than expected. Once caught in the ice, the crew disembarked to wait on land, setting up a temporary camp on the ice nearby. The company evacuated most of the crew by aircraft, leaving behind a small group including the ship's captain to monitor the vessel and wait for the thaw. On October 15th, the ice shifted. The Beichimo was freed briefly, only to be caught again days later. Then, without warning, a blizzard struck on November 24th. When it cleared, the crew awoke to find the Beichimo gone. At first, they assumed the ship had sunk, pulled beneath the ice by pressure ridges or cracks. But days later, an Inuit seal hunter reported sighting the vessel about 45 miles to the southwest. The crew tracked it down and found it again adrift but intact. After assessing the damage and the worsening conditions, the Hudson's Bay Company decided the ship was no longer worth saving. The remaining crew salvaged what they could and abandoned her. The Arctic was expected to claim the vessel soon, but it didn't. The Beichimo, instead of sinking, remained afloat for years, then decades. Over the next 38 years, the Beichimo would be sighted repeatedly, still adrift in Arctic waters. Inuit hunters, coastal settlers, and passing ships all reported encounters with the phantom steamer. It was usually seen lodged in pack ice, drifting slowly, or floating just offshore. The sightings became so regular that maps of the region began to mark her last known locations. In March 1933, a group of Inuit people boarded the vessel near Wainwright, Alaska. They reported finding the ship mostly intact, though weathered. The cargo holds had been emptied in earlier salvaging efforts, but the interior still contained equipment and supplies. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of life, just the wind and the ship. In 1939, the Alaskan government considered salvaging the Beichimo, but the project was abandoned when it was determined that the ice made such an effort too dangerous and costly. She had by then become known among locals as the ghost ship of the Arctic. Unlike other ghost ships that disappear after a single incident, the Beichimo became a long-term mystery. Her repeated reappearances gave her an eerie presence. She did not sink, she did not ground. She simply continued to exist unmanned and unclaimed, drifting through ice-choked waters, never truly lost. In 1940, she was spotted again near the Beaufort Sea. In 1962, she was seen 160 kilometers west of Point Barrow. Each time, the vessel had drifted to a new location. No human footprints ever accompanied these sightings. No signs of maintenance. Her superstructure was gradually decaying, her deck stripped by weather, but her hull remained intact. In 1969, she was seen for the last time, frozen in ice near the Beaufort Sea. After that, no further confirmed sightings were recorded. No wreckage was found, no parts were recovered. It was assumed that, after nearly 40 years of drifting, she had finally succumbed to the ice and weather, disappearing beneath the Arctic surface. But no wreck has been discovered to confirm it. The Beichimo's prolonged survival defied expectations. Ships are not built to endure decades of freezing temperatures without human care. Ice pressure usually breaks apart hulls. Corrosion from salt water eats away at steel. Yet, the Beichimo remained. Speculations about her resilience varied. Some suggested her specific design and hull shape allowed her to ride ice rather than be crushed by it. Others believed the ship's regular entrapment in ice actually insulated her from the worst waves and storms. But no one could explain how she managed to avoid grounding or breaking apart. In later decades, maritime historians took interest in the ship. Expeditions were considered to find her remains. In 2006, the Alaskan government launched a project to locate the wreck. The Department of Natural Resources requested public assistance, asking pilots, hunters, and ships to report any possible sightings. But nothing came of the effort. The Beichimo is one of the few ghost ships whose disappearance was gradual and publicly witnessed. Her story unfolded over decades, witnessed by hundreds of people. She did not vanish in a storm or after a single tragedy. She simply drifted, visible but unreachable, appearing at irregular intervals before fading again into sea and fog. There were no disappearances aboard her, no mutiny, no unknown cargo. Just a vessel rendered unusable and then forgotten. She was never looted, never claimed by pirates. Her engine remained silent. Her crew moved on. And the ship, left to the ice, became something else entirely, an unmoored presence, moving quietly through one of the most remote corners of the world. The Beichimo is not like the Mary Celeste, where mystery comes from absence, nor like the Kaz 2, where modern technology failed to prevent vanishing. The Beichimo was never missing. It was always out there, somewhere drifting just beyond reach, moving slowly between currents, lost only in the sense that no one knew what to do with it. It never sank. No gravesite has been found. The Arctic, in its quiet way, may still hold her, encased in ice, unseen beneath a frozen shelf. Or perhaps she was crushed, quietly, under pressure during a thaw. Perhaps she lies beneath layers of sea and snow, her steel rusting in slow silence. What remains is a record of sightings, a log of confirmed encounters, a set of photographs showing a ship no one owned moving from one patch of ice to another. A ghost, not because it vanished, but because it refused to die. The Bachimo became a permanent guest of the Arctic, unbothered, unguided, and unstopped. Not haunted, not cursed, just forgotten and drifting. The Resolven, a ship left intact with no crew aboard. On August 29, 1884, the Royal Navy gunboat Mallard was patrolling the Labrador Sea when its crew sighted a small brig drifting slowly through calm waters. The vessel was the Resolven, a Canadian merchant ship registered in New Brunswick. Her sails were loosely hanging, her rigging slack, but she was not damaged. She had not run aground. The sea was still. Yet there was no one on deck. No response to the gunboat's signal. No sign of life at all. The Mallard dispatched a boarding party. What they found surprised them. The Resolven appeared perfectly seaworthy. Her cargo was intact. The galley was stocked with provisions. The crew's personal effects, clothes, tobacco, pipes remained in their quarters. Charts were laid out on the navigation table. A kettle of water sat on the stove, as if someone had left it only moments earlier. But the captain, officers, and crew, 7 people in total, were gone. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no overturned furniture, no broken masts or torn sails. One of the ship's lifeboats was missing. The other remained securely fastened to the deck. But there was no indication of a panic or sudden emergency. Everything was in place, except the people. The Resolven had departed from Quebec earlier that month, carrying a cargo of timber and bound for Bathurst, New Brunswick. Her captain, known to be an experienced sailor, had made the coastal run many times before. The route passed along the northern coast of Newfoundland and then into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was a route that included fog, variable weather, and icebergs, but was not considered especially hazardous in late summer. When the Mallard discovered the vessel, the sea was calm and visibility was good. The boarding party noted that the ship was only lightly damaged, minor scuffs on the hull, possibly from drifting ice, but nothing that would warrant abandonment. Her masts were upright. The sails, though untidy, had not been shredded by storms. The main hold was dry. The bilge pumps were functional. No distress flag had been raised. The gunboat's commander ordered that the vessel be towed into harbour. It was brought to the nearest port, where British and Canadian officials began an inquiry. The Resolven was inspected carefully. The logbook was missing. So was the ship's chronometer and sextant. But there were no signs of theft. The vessel's cargo, valued at the time, had not been disturbed. No valuables had been taken from the officers' cabins. No food had been looted. The investigators found that the stove in the galley had been recently used. There were biscuits on a plate. A partially completed log was later found, water damaged, in the chart room. It contained the last entry from 2 days earlier. The entry did not mention bad weather or mechanical problems, just a routine report of position and wind. If the crew had left the ship in one of its lifeboats, they had done so calmly. The ship had not been abandoned in haste. There were no signs of a scuffle or emergency. No sails had been dropped. No anchor was deployed. The helm was not lashed. The ship had simply been left to drift. Weather records showed no storms in the region at the time. A few light fog banks had moved through. The water temperature was cold, but not freezing. If the crew had abandoned ship, their lifeboat should have been spotted. But no survivors were ever located. No bodies were found. No overturned boats washed ashore. Local newspapers picked up the story. One paper referred to it as a silent departure. Another compared it to the Mary Celeste, whose crew had vanished under similarly undramatic circumstances just over a decade earlier. But the Resolven did not capture the public imagination in the same way. Its story was smaller, its vessel less famous. The case was quietly closed, listed as an unsolved abandonment. Maritime theorists proposed a few ideas. One suggestion was that the ship had struck a small iceberg or submerged object, causing the captain to fear imminent sinking. But the Resolven was dry. There was no sign of damage below the waterline. The pumps had not been activated. Another theory proposed that a sudden wave or collision had swept crew members overboard. But there was no evidence of trauma on deck. Some speculated that carbon monoxide poisoning or toxic fumes may have incapacitated the crew, but the ship's stove burned coal, and no signs of soot or malfunction were found. Others mentioned the possibility of a mutiny, but there was no evidence of conflict or disorder. The missing lifeboat may have suggested that the crew had simply left, believing the ship would not remain afloat. But why abandon a sound vessel in calm seas? The most plausible theory offered at the time was ice-related fear. The ship may have become briefly trapped in floating pack ice or damaged in a way the captain believed was more serious than it appeared. If they believed the hull had been breached or that rescue was imminent from a nearby ship, they might have taken to the lifeboat. But that would not explain why the log and navigational tools were missing, nor why there was no sign of distress. And it would not explain why the crew vanished without a trace. Later, maritime logs recorded no claims from the Resolven's missing crew, no messages in bottles, no sightings, no survivors. In the years that followed, the ship's name occasionally appeared in compilations of strange sea stories, usually alongside more dramatic examples. But it remained one of the quietest disappearances. No storm, no battle, no flames, just a floating merchant brig with meals prepared, rigging slack, and nothing to explain the silence. The ship was eventually sold and returned to service under another name. It continued to sail for several more years before being decommissioned. But the mystery of August 1884 was never revisited by authorities. There were no inquests, no tribunals, no findings of fault. The Resolven was not a famous ship. It carried no gold, no diplomats, no secret cargo. It was just a small merchant brig with a simple route and a vanished crew. But in the history of ghost ships, it stands out for how little was wrong. It did not burn. It did not sink. It was not looted. It did not drift far from land. And yet, 7 men stepped off it into the unknown, never to return. In a sea filled with catastrophe, the Resolven left behind only normalcy and absence. A ship waiting for instructions, decks in order, provisions packed, wind at its back, but no voices, no hands, no destination. The Zebrina, a schooner found ashore without its crew. On October 17, 1917, the British sailing barge Zebrina was discovered aground on the coast of France, near the town of Rosal Point in the department of Manche. The ship had drifted ashore with her sails still set. There were no signs of damage. The hull was intact. The cargo, mostly coal, was untouched, but the crew, all 5 members, was missing. They were never seen again. The Sabrina was a 3-masted schooner built in 1873 in Whitstable, England. By 1917, she was primarily used for short cross-channel trips, transporting coal and other cargo between English and French ports. She had left the port of Falmouth on October 15th, bound for Saint-Brieuc in Brittany. The weather was mild. The voyage was expected to last just a few days. She never reached her destination. When French authorities boarded the ship after it ran aground, they found the cabins neat and orderly. Meals had been eaten. The captain's quarters contained his papers, charts, and personal effects. There were no signs of panic. The decks were clean. The lifeboat was missing. The ship had apparently continued on course under the influence of wind and current after being abandoned. The tide had carried her to shore, where she gently grounded in shallow water. The mystery was immediate. The Sabrina had not been caught in a storm. No nearby ships had reported distress signals. The coast was peaceful. There were no marks of collision, no bullet holes, no fire. The only thing missing was the crew. World War I was ongoing. The waters of the English Channel and western France were known to be patrolled by German U-boats. The war had already claimed hundreds of merchant ships, many sunk without warning. At the time, the prevailing theory was that the Sabrina had been intercepted by a submarine. The crew, it was suggested, had been taken aboard the German vessel, and the ship left adrift. This theory explained the absence of the crew and the intact condition of the vessel, but it had problems. German naval records released after the war showed no record of a U-boat encounter with the Sabrina. Submarine commanders were required to document all interactions with civilian vessels, especially those in which a crew was taken aboard. No mention of the ship or its crew appeared in the logs of any U-boat operating in the area during that time period. The ship was not listed as having been attacked or captured. Another issue with the submarine theory was the cargo. The Sabrina was transporting coal, not a valuable wartime commodity at the time, and not a strategic military shipment. There was little reason to seize the crew or scuttle the ship. And if the crew had been ordered off the vessel, why leave the ship entirely under sail, rather than scuttle it or sink it with charges? Standard German procedure for contraband cargo involved placing explosives aboard or opening the seacocks to flood the hull. None of that was done. The Sabrina was found dry and upright. A second theory suggested that the crew may have panicked after seeing a periscope or believing themselves to be under attack. They could have fled in the lifeboat, abandoning the ship in haste. If that had happened, they may have been lost at sea, swamped by waves, or caught in rough current. But conditions in the channel were calm at the time of the voyage. The French coast was not far, and the missing lifeboat was never found. No wreckage from it ever washed ashore. No bodies were recovered. The lack of damage to the ship continued to puzzle investigators. The masts were intact. The sails, while loosened by wind, had not been torn. The rigging was slack but not broken. No halyards had been cut. The rudder and wheel were functional. The ship had drifted on a straight path before grounding. It had not been left in disarray. The Sabrina was towed off the beach and returned to service. The British Board of Trade conducted a brief inquiry but found no evidence of negligence or crime. No report was filed. The ship was not marked as lost or damaged. It simply resumed its commercial work. The missing crew was declared lost at sea. Their families received no further information. In the years that followed, the story faded from public attention. The First World War had created thousands of maritime casualties, both civilian and military. One missing crew of 5 was not unusual in the context of submarine warfare. But maritime historians continued to note the strangeness of the Sabrina's condition. Unlike other wartime losses, there were no reports of enemy fire and no signs of forced boarding. The only missing object was the lifeboat. The ship itself had not been looted. The crew's belongings remained. Watches, boots, tools, and clothing were left behind. The vessel's papers were untouched. It was not stripped, not sabotaged, not hidden, just empty. Some speculated that a sudden medical emergency such as food poisoning or gas exposure could have affected the crew, but no evidence supported that idea. There were no signs of contamination, no chemicals were stored on board, and no other ships reported illness or similar events in the region. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. The most plausible suggestion remains that the crew voluntarily abandoned the ship. Why they did so, however, is not known. Whether it was due to misperception of threat, confusion, or some unknown encounter at sea is unresolved. The Sabrina's case remains one of the few maritime incidents in which a vessel was found entirely intact, under sail, with cargo in place, yet with every human being missing. It is the calmness of the scene that stands out. The ship was not in chaos. The sea was not stormy. The war was not visible on the horizon. Just 5 men gone, a lifeboat missing, and a ship quietly beached, as if steered by invisible hands to the French shore. The Sabrina was eventually scrapped in the 1930s, having returned to trade service after her brief moment of mystery. No further incidents occurred aboard her. No new information about the lost crew ever surfaced. Today, the ship is remembered primarily for that 2-day gap in 1917, when something unknown happened, quietly, without force, and left no mark but an empty deck. It remains a minor footnote in the long list of ghost ships, but one of the few that carried nothing unusual, no strange cargo, no malfunction, no warship on the horizon, only silence, and a gentle drift to shore. The SV Lunatic, the solo sailor who vanished without alarm. In November 2017, the SV Lunatic, a 36-foot sailing yacht, was found drifting near the coast of Sri Lanka. The boat appeared well maintained. Its sails were down. The hull bore no damage. The name on the stern Lunatic was painted in black letters above a Croatian flag. Local fishermen noticed the drifting vessel first and alerted the Sri Lankan Navy. When boarding crews arrived, they found the boat empty. There were no signs of distress. The logbook remained on the chart table. Personal belongings were still arranged in the cabin. The single crew member, a Croatian sailor named Đure Turk, was missing. Đure Turk was not unknown in sailing circles. A retired shipbuilder and seasoned sailor from Slovenia, formerly part of Yugoslavia, had spent decades at sea. He was experienced, meticulous, and committed to solo navigation. By 2017, he was 72 years old. He had already completed several long-distance voyages and had written books about his sailing experiences. His boat, the Lunatic, was home-built, constructed primarily of wood and fiberglass, and had been used for transoceanic passages since the early 1990s. Turk's goal on this final voyage was to circumnavigate the globe solo and non-stop, without the use of a motor, relying only on sails and self-steering. He had set out from New Zealand in December 2007 and was last heard from on January 1, 2009. On that day, he transmitted a brief radio message to another vessel, stating that he was 1,000 nautical miles off the west coast of Australia. He reported good weather, no technical issues, and his usual calm tone. It was the last time anyone heard from him. For months after his last message, there was silence. No distress calls were received. No emergency beacons were triggered. No sightings were confirmed. Friends, family, and fellow sailors monitored his expected course but received no updates. The ocean remained quiet. Then, in April 2009, a passing merchant ship sighted the lunatic adrift in the Indian Ocean, over 500 nautical miles from the nearest land. The ship approached but did not board. Later that month, another vessel spotted the yacht again still drifting. This time, the sails were tattered, the hull was weather-beaten. No movement was observed on board. The ship did not stop to investigate. It was not until months later, when Sri Lankan authorities recovered the vessel near their coastline, that the lunatic's condition was formally documented. The hull was intact, the cabin was dry, the sail rigging was mostly in place, though worn by exposure. Navigation tools were found inside. Charts were marked. The logbook ended on January 2, 2009, one day after Turk's last known radio message. The entry contained nothing unusual, just a location, a wind speed, and routine notes about direction and sail trim. His personal belongings were untouched. There was no evidence of struggle, no broken lines, no sign of piracy. His harness was missing, suggesting he may have been clipped in when last on deck. But the tether was not found. His life jacket was also absent. The implication was that he had gone overboard, possibly while adjusting sails or during routine checks. In high seas or a sudden swell, even an experienced sailor can be caught off balance. The self-steering vane was still attached. The compass, though worn, remained functional. The vessel showed no sign of collision. There were no reports of storms in the area on the dates surrounding his last transmission. The sea had been moderate. Winds were steady. Turk's disappearance was ruled accidental. Most believe he was lost overboard while sailing solo, something not uncommon in long-distance, single-handed navigation. Without another person on board, a sailor who falls into the ocean is unlikely to be recovered. Even with a tether, accidents can happen. If the tether fails, or if the sailor cannot climb back aboard, the result is usually fatal. The yacht, once recovered, was brought to shore and inspected by regional authorities. It was later moved to a harbour in Colombo. The Slovenian government acknowledged Turk's presumed death and praised his contributions to sailing literature and solo navigation. He was eulogized as a quiet, determined sailor who pursued his passion to the end. Turk had written before about the psychological effects of solitude at sea. In one of his earlier works, he noted that the sea asks for everything and offers nothing back. He was not naive about the risks. His boat was small, Spartan, and designed for endurance rather than comfort. He carried a shortwave radio, a wind-powered generator, and enough provisions for months. He did not carry an Eperba decision. That puzzled some, but reflected his wish to complete the journey in full independence. The lunatic's final months of drift added to its quiet symbolism. It remained at sea long after its skipper was gone, traveling on wind alone, with no guidance, no correction, no course. Sailors who later viewed the vessel, noted how intact it was. The tiller rope was still in place. Cooking utensils sat neatly in a box. Charts were rolled and secured. There was no panic in the scene, just absence. Unlike other ghost ships, the Lunatic was not a mystery of sudden disappearance or possible mutiny. It was the natural endpoint of a solo sailor's life at sea. A man on a small vessel, carrying his logbook, navigating by stars, and trusting wind vanes over engines. It did not return under sail. It drifted, waiting. The ocean, indifferent, brought it back. Some pieces of the Lunatic were preserved. Photographs were taken. The story was shared across sailing forums and quiet maritime circles. But there was no public outcry, no investigations beyond what was required, no scandal. Just the facts, a name, a date, and an empty deck. Turk's son, also a sailor, wrote that his father would not have wanted a dramatic ending. He said that disappearing at sea was not tragic to his father, was peaceful. In a letter he wrote, "He vanished in the place he loved most. He was alone, but he chose to be." The Lunatic, named perhaps as a nod to the solitude its captain embraced, now exists as a footnote in the long ledger of ghost vessels. But unlike those abandoned in panic or lost in war, it tells a different story. Of endurance, of quiet routine, and of a sailor who sailed into the sea, made his notes, adjusted his sail sand, never came back. The SV Sayo, found adrift with a dead captain still aboard. On February 25, 2016, local fishermen off the coast of Borobo in Surigao del Sur in the southern Philippines noticed something unusual. A small white sailing yacht was drifting slowly, alone, with no visible crew. The vessel's mast was damaged, the sails were torn and hanging loose. Algae and salt stains ran along the waterline. It looked aged, but not destroyed. It simply appeared adrift. The fishermen approached cautiously and called the local coast guard. When a boarding party arrived, they found the yacht eerily silent. Its name, painted in black lettering on the stern, read Sayo. When they entered the cabin, the scene was still and undisturbed. Inside the navigation area, slumped over the desk, was the mummified body of a man. He was seated, hunched forward slightly, one hand resting on the table, the other still near a pen. Charts and papers lay scattered in front of him. A pair of eyeglasses rested near the edge. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no panic. The windows had been shut. The cabin was dry, windless, and quiet. There was no one else aboard. The man was soon identified as Manfred Fritz Bajorat, a 59-year-old solo sailor from Germany. Documents, including his passport and boat registration, confirmed his identity. Personal belongings remained intact. Cash was untouched. A satellite phone sat on a shelf, its battery long dead. In the galley, cans of food and supplies were still stored neatly. Nothing appeared ransacked or disturbed. No forced entry, no sign of others. Just one man, long dead, still aboard his boat. Bajorat was well known in sailing circles, particularly among long-distance cruisers. He had spent decades at sea, often living aboard full-time, sailing between ports in Europe, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. His vessel, the Sayo, was a 13-meter Jeanneau Sun Magic 44-an ocean-capable yacht, designed for endurance and comfort. Built in France, this class of vessel was widely used for long offshore voyages. Bajorat had made extensive modifications over the years. Extra solar panels, reinforced rigging, redundant steering systems, and updated communications. He had converted it into a self-sustaining, floating home. In his earlier years, Bajorat had sailed with his wife Claudia. Together they had completed multiple transatlantic crossings. They eventually separated, and Claudia later died of cancer. According to a letter found on board, Bajorat still grieved her loss deeply. The letter, handwritten and dated in 2010, was a private message of farewell. It read in part, "30 years we were together on the same path. Then the power of the demons was stronger than your will. You're gone." Though written years before his death, it revealed something of the solitude he had carried with him. In the final months of his life, Bajorat had remained mostly off-grid. His last confirmed contact was believed to be in mid-2015, though reports varied. Some sources suggested he had emailed friends from the Indian Ocean. Others believed he had docked in port in Mauritius or Papua New Guinea. What is known is that by late 2015, he had left harbour for a new leg of his journey. No one heard from him after that. When the Sayo was found, Bajorat's body had already undergone partial mummification. Forensic investigators noted that the cabin's dry, salty conditions helped preserve the body unusually well. With the windows sealed and tropical sun filtering in, the air inside became dehydrated. This slowed decomposition. Unlike in colder or more humid environments, there were few insects. The body, seated in the same position for weeks, possibly months, remained largely intact. Authorities initially opened a death investigation. The unusual appearance of the remains led to public speculation. Photographs of the scene were leaked to international press. Some early headlines speculated about pirates or a violent incident at sea. But forensic analysis quickly ruled out foul play. There were no signs of trauma or injury, no broken bones, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The most likely cause was naturally either a heart attack or stroke. He had likely died instantly while seated. The navigation logbook ended abruptly. The final entry was dated early 2016. It contained standard notes, coordinates, wind speed, headings, nothing out of the ordinary. The vessel's location, at the time of discovery, was hundreds of miles off course, suggesting it had been drifting for some time. The sails were torn, likely from storms. The mast was partially broken, possibly damaged after Bajorat's death. With no one at the helm and no automated steering engaged, the boat had wandered aimlessly through the Philippine Sea, carried slowly by current and wind. The Filipino authorities towed the vessel ashore. An autopsy was conducted at a local facility. German consular officials assisted in arranging the repatriation of Bajorat's remains. The final report confirmed natural causes. Toxicology tests showed no poisoning. There were no substances in the cabin to suggest suicide or exposure. The conclusion was quiet. A sailor died alone, while doing what he had done for most of his life. In the sailing community, Bajorat's death resonated deeply. Forums and discussion groups shared memories of encounters in harbors and marinas. Many remembered him as soft-spoken, practical, and solitary, a man who had chosen the sea as his home, who asked little of others and left little behind. He had never sought attention. His final voyage, like many before it, had been made without fanfare. He simply departed. Unlike other so-called ghost ships, where entire crews vanish or lifeboats are lowered in panic, the Sayo was a quiet exception. The vessel returned with its occupant, Nothing was missing. Nothing was rearranged. There was no uncertainty about what had happened. Only a long silence before the boat was seen again. Solo sailors accept risk as part of their routine. The ocean is vast, weather changes without notice, and help is often thousands of miles away. Many long-distance cruisers carry emergency beacons, but not all do. Bajarat had a satellite phone, but no EPIRB was found aboard. Perhaps he had once carried one and let it expire. Or perhaps he accepted that he would one day not return. As his son later said in an interview, "My father died the way he lived at sea, alone, on his own terms." The Sayo was briefly held by port authorities before being released. Its final fate is unknown. It was considered too weathered for resale and too personal for display. It may have been scrapped quietly, or it may rest now in some private shipyard, its logbook stored away, its charts still marked with the course of its final drift. The image of Bajarat, alone in his cabin, preserved by wind and salt, became a haunting one. Not tragic, but deeply still. The ocean did not take him in a storm. There was no wave, no accident. Just a quiet moment perhaps, a breath hand, then stillness. His life was not recorded by medals or records, but by passages on water, the names of ports, the knots of wind, the condition of sails. His story was written not in one moment but in years of quiet travel between islands, across seas, always toward horizon. The Sayo drifted alone until someone noticed, until it neared a coast and someone looked inside, until the story returned, and then it was done. The Gianseng II, an unmarked freighter in Indonesian waters. On January 3, 2018, a large, rusting freighter was spotted drifting near the island of Batam in Indonesia's Riau archipelago. The vessel had no visible crew on board. No national flag flew from its mast. Its name, if it had one, had been painted over. The hull bore heavy corrosion. The deck was littered with debris. It appeared to be a bulk carrier, possibly over 80 meters long, and of Southeast Asian origin. Indonesian authorities were alerted after a group of local fishermen came across the vessel and reported its presence. The Navy and Coast Guard dispatched a boarding team to investigate. When officials arrived, they found a ship that was intact but entirely abandoned. No one responded to radio hails. No sounds came from within. The vessel was dead in the water, drifting slowly with the current. When the boarding team entered, they found a scene similar to others in maritime history. Machinery idle, cabins stripped, personal effects missing, and no humans aboard. The bridge was open. Charts were scattered across the console. Most of the electronics were missing or had been damaged by weather and theft. Cables had been cut or removed entirely. The control room below deck was water damaged but accessible. The engine room was intact, though silent. There was no working generator. The engine had not been run for some time. No fuel remained in the tanks. Cabins showed signs of former occupancy, but no clothing, documentation, or identifying materials were left behind. Walls were stained with mold. Cupboards were open and empty. Food stores had long since spoiled. The galley was rusted and full of broken items. The ship had clearly been adrift for weeks, possibly months, before it entered Indonesian waters. The hull bore no IMO number. This made tracking its origin nearly impossible. Normally, vessels of that size are required by maritime law to carry a unique identifier, visible on the bow or stern. This number links to registration databases that record the ship's name, owner, construction date, and flag state. But this vessel had been stripped. Whatever markings it once had were obscured. Even the engine serial plates had been scratched or removed. Initial assumptions pointed toward abandonment. Naval officers believed it may have been a decommissioned freighter, previously used for coastal cargo runs between smaller ports. Such vessels, when retired, are often sold to scrap yards or resold through informal networks. If a ship is no longer profitable or safe to operate, it may be left to drift, an illegal but not uncommon practice in certain regions. Some suspected the vessel might have been a ghost ship from the unregulated shipping fleets that operate in Southeast Asia. These fleets are often linked to illegal fishing or smuggling operations. A ship may be used to support such activities, refueling trawlers, transporting unregistered catch, or moving illicit goods. Once no longer useful, the ship is sometimes stripped for salvageable materials and cast adrift, effectively abandoned. There were signs that this might have been the case. The hull had been modified in several places. Weld marks on the deck suggested the previous installation of removable fuel tanks. The hold, when inspected, was empty but showed evidence of previous use for non-standard cargo. No records were found, no crew manifests, no bills of lading. The only items discovered were old ropes, corroded chains, and fragments of tarpaulin. The Indonesian authorities began to refer to the vessel informally as Gianseng II, drawing a comparison to the earlier case of the Gianseng, a ghost ship found adrift off the coast of northern Australia in 2006. Like its predecessor, this vessel had no name, no crew, and no documentation. It had simply appeared drifting, silent, without a past or future. Speculation grew. Some maritime analysts proposed that the ship may have broken free from a towing line while en route to a scrapping yard in South Asia. Old ships, especially those deemed unfit for active service, are often towed long distances to Bangladesh or India for dismantling. But to tow a vessel without proper identifiers is a violation of international shipping laws. There were no tugboats in the vicinity. No recent reports of lost tows had been filed with maritime authorities. Another theory suggested that the vessel had been used as a floating base for unlicensed fishing fleets. The South China Sea and the surrounding waters of the Coral Triangle are home to a network of such fleets, which often operate far beyond national regulations. Ships in these fleets are routinely swapped, renamed, repainted, or abandoned entirely to avoid fines or enforcement. The absence of identity markers on the Gianseng II would be consistent with this behavior. A third theory, less grounded but often discussed in the maritime world, proposed that the ship may have been intentionally abandoned in deep water by its operators and allowed to drift into Indonesian territory. This tactic is occasionally employed to rid fleets of unwanted tonnage without paying port fees or scrapping costs. The hope is that the vessel will disappear or sink unnoticed. But currents can carry such ships for weeks before they encounter populated shores. As the investigation continued, local media became interested in the story. The image of a large, empty freighter drifting without crew captured attention. The rusted hull, barnacle-streaked and silent, evoked comparisons to famous ghost ships of the past. But no further information emerged. Satellite imagery was inconclusive. AIS automatic identification system trackers, which record ship movements, showed no matches. No insurance companies reported a missing vessel. No shipping company filed a claim. Eventually, The Indonesian government made the decision to remove the vessel. It was deemed a navigational hazard, too large to leave adrift, too corroded to tow safely. A controlled demolition was considered, but environmental concerns delayed the process. Officials worried that onboard contaminants, fuel residue, asbestos, or corroded heavy metals could harm marine life. Ultimately, the ship was anchored in a restricted area and dismantled in stages by a salvage contractor. Its components, steel plates, wiring, degraded electronics, were sold for scrap. Its frame was cut apart by blowtorch, hauled ashore, and melted down. No identifying items were ever recovered. The name Jian Sang II remained unofficial. The vessel entered no database and left no record. It was a ship without a past. But in maritime communities, it became another name on the list. Another freighter found at sea, empty and alone, with no clue to its origin or journey. Among the many forgotten ships that roam the oceans, some are victims of storms, others of war, and many of economic neglect. This one had simply been removed from the system, erased in function, but not in form. In the final assessment, the Jian Sang II was not mysterious in the supernatural sense. There were no ghostly apparitions, no unresolved messages, no mummified captain at the helm. But its silence was of a different kind. It belonged to a growing group of maritime relics, discarded, undocumented, and unaccounted for, set adrift in waters that no longer want them. Such ships remind us of the shadow side of modern shipping, the unregulated movements, the lack of oversight in secondary markets. The vessels that serve until they cost more to anchor than they are worth. And then they are pushed from port into open water and left to move with the tide. The ocean does not reject them. It carries them, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, and eventually someone sees them again. A hull, a name erased, a deck empty, and nothing else. The Jian Sang II, unnamed and unclaimed, drifted into view, and then it too was gone. The Lyubov Orlova, a luxury cruise ship turned wandering wreck. In early 2013, a derelict luxury cruise liner began drifting through the North Atlantic Ocean. The ship was the Lyubov Orlova, once a Soviet-built passenger vessel that had carried tourists to the Arctic and Antarctic regions for decades. But by the time it left port for the last time, it was no longer a vessel of purpose. It had no working crew, no destination, and no control. It had become something else entirely, a wandering hulk, carried only by ocean currents and winds, unmonitored, unclaimed, and eventually lost to both navigation and time. The Lyubov Orlova was built in 1976 in Yugoslavia and named after a famous Soviet film actress. For many years, the vessel was used for polar cruises, carrying passengers to remote parts of the world. It was 295 feet long and capable of carrying more than 100 guests, along with a full complement of staff and crew. Its reinforced hull made it suitable for ice navigation, and for a time it served as a reliable vessel in a niche tourist market. But maintenance was expensive, and by 2010, the ship had been taken out of service. After falling into disrepair, the Lyubov Orlova was impounded in the port of St. John's, Newfoundland, due to unpaid debts. Crew members were stranded aboard for months until they were repatriated. The ship sat at anchor for nearly 2 years, rusting and inactive, while court disputes and ownership transfers delayed its fate. Eventually, it was sold for scrap. The plan was simple: tow the vessel to the Dominican Republic, where it would be dismantled. On January 23, 2013, the tugboat Charlene Hunt was assigned to move the ship out of Canadian waters. Weather conditions were poor. Within 24 hours, as the convoy entered open ocean, the tow line snapped. The ship was set adrift. The tug's crew was unable to reattach the line in worsening weather. The Lyubov Orlova floated away into the fog, unpowered and unmanned. At first, Canadian authorities monitored the situation. There was concern the vessel might drift back toward land and run aground. Transport Canada allowed it to continue drifting eastward, under the assumption that it would be carried into international waters and eventually sink. Days passed. Then weeks. The Lyubov Orlova was not seen again by official vessels. On February 4th, a signal was picked up from one of the ship's emergency position indicating radio beacons EPIRBs. It had been activated not by human hands, but automatically, likely triggered by contact with water. This meant part of the ship had begun to flood. But the signal lasted only briefly. It then disappeared. Another EPIB signal was received on February 23rd. This one came from a different location, further east. Again, it was brief. Again, there was no follow-up. These transmissions suggested that the ship had not sunk entirely. Parts of it were still above water, or at least they had been. After that, there were no more signals. Satellite imagery showed no confirmed sightings. Maritime patrols in the North Atlantic spotted nothing unusual. The vastness of the ocean and the absence of a working transponder made locating the vessel nearly impossible. Oceanographers suggested it may have drifted toward the coast of Ireland or Scotland, or perhaps south toward the Azores. The currents in that region are complex. The ship could have wandered in nearly any direction. The story attracted international media attention. Headlines began to appear: ghost ship drifts toward Europe, unmanned cruise liner on the loose, ship of rats at sea. Some reports speculated that the ship was infested with rodents, surviving by cannibalism. These claims were based more on imagination than evidence. But the tone was consistent. A vessel had escaped its fate, and now no one knew where it was. Despite the attention, no government took responsibility. Canada had allowed the ship to drift. The Dominican Republic never accepted delivery. The ship had no working systems. It emitted no signal. There was no crew to assist in navigation, no power to control movement. The ocean carried it, but no one knew where. Maritime safety officials considered it a hazard. If the Lyubov Orlova remained afloat, it could threaten other vessels. At nearly 300 feet in length, a collision could be catastrophic. But tracking it proved impossible. Satellite monitoring in the open ocean is limited by resolution and frequency. No aircraft or ships reported visual contact. Radar pings from commercial vessels turned up nothing. The ship became a rumor, a headline, and then a footnote. No wreckage washed ashore. No life rafts or debris were found. The most likely outcome, according to maritime analysts, was that the vessel eventually sank somewhere in the North Atlantic. Without ballast, rudder control, or functioning pumps, it would have taken on water slowly. Structural corrosion, already advanced from years of neglect, would have accelerated once the hull was exposed to wave action. A rogue wave, a prolonged storm, or ice could have contributed to the end. But no one witnessed it. In the years following, the Lyubov Orlova continued to appear in articles, books, and maritime discussions. It joined the small group of known ships that have vanished while adrift, beyond all rescue and outside all command. It was never located. Its final coordinates were never confirmed. The last signal it ever sent came from hundreds of miles off the Irish coast. After that, it was gone. It was not the first ship to disappear this way, but it was one of the largest modern vessels to go missing without people, without fire, and without pursuit. There were no pirates, no war, no explosion, just silence. The ship was neither ancient nor legendary. It had no mystical reputation. It was built in the Cold War, used for tourism, and eventually sold for scrap. But when it became adrift, it became something else. A reminder of how easily control can be lost, and how vast the ocean remains seven in the age of GPS and global communication. The Lubov Orlova was last seen by human eyes in late January 2013, when it disappeared into Atlantic fog. For days, its white hull and blue trim could still be made out through binoculars from distant ships. Then, not even that. It never sent a mayday. It never issued a course correction. It floated empty, directionless, and unclaimed. It is possible that pieces of it now rest on the seabed, thousands of meters down, scattered and unmarked. It is possible that parts of the hull remain intact, preserved by cold and pressure. But no salvage mission has been launched. No signal has reappeared. Some believe it may yet be afloat. In theory, its airtight compartments and reinforced hull could keep it buoyant for years. There are historical precedent ships that drifted for decades after abandonment. But without propulsion, any such survival would be passive, silent, and eventually final. Among ghost ships, the Lyubov Orlova is not the most mysterious, but it is one of the most modern. It was large, steel, and built with radar and radio. But in the end, those things did not save it. The ocean ignored its systems. The fog closed in, and then the records ended. Its absence tells a story no less powerful than a discovery. A ship that did not burn, did not sink by storm, did not collide. It simply left and did not return. There are no plaques, no wrecks to visit, no closure, only water, and the quiet space where it once was. The High Aim 6, a ghost ship found with engines running. On January 3, 2003, an Australian surveillance plane flying over the northern coast of Western Australia spotted a fishing vessel drifting in open waters. It was about 180 kilometers off the coast near Broome. The ship showed no signs of activity. No one appeared on deck. Its name, High Aim 6, was clearly painted on the hull. The vessel was upright, intact, and its engine was running. From above, there was no indication that anything was wrong, yet the crew was nowhere to be seen. Days later, on January 8th, an Australian Navy patrol vessel approached and boarded the High Aim 6. What they found on board made little sense. The engine was still engaged, though it had been running at low idle. The autopilot was activated. The navigation systems were functioning. There were no distress signals. The radio was intact. The ship's electronics were powered. Fuel levels were sufficient. The radar still swept its usual arc, yet not a single person was present. Personal items remained in the crew's quarters. Clothing was stored in bags. Tools were arranged neatly in the engine room. There were no signs of violence. No broken glass, no overturned furniture. The kitchen area still contained food. A bowl of rice was found, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no scattered belongings. It appeared as if the crew had simply stepped away. But they had not returned. The High Aim 6 was a Taiwanese-owned, Indonesian-crewed longline fishing vessel, about 20 meters in length. It was registered in Taiwan and operated regularly throughout the Indonesian Exclusive Economic Zone and parts of the Timor Sea. Its primary mission was tuna fishing, and it had departed the port of Jakarta on December 31, 2002. It had been at sea for only a few days when it was last heard from. Investigators traced ownership to Tai Huang Shue, a Taiwanese businessman who confirmed the vessel's identity and its expected route. He had last spoken with the ship's captain Cheng Tachun on December 30th. The conversation was routine. There were no reports of trouble, no request for assistance. The captain, a 49-year-old experienced sailor from Taiwan, had operated similar vessels for years without incident. His chief engineer was also Taiwanese. The rest of the crew, thought to number around 10, were Indonesian nationals. The ship's logbook offered no useful information. The last entry was dated December 30th and contained routine notations: weather, position, equipment checks. There were no entries after that date. No records of emergency, no indication of navigational deviation. The GPS coordinates showed a course consistent with tuna fishing operations. When questioned, nearby ports and maritime authorities reported no sightings, no distress calls were received, no debris fields had been found. The weather at the time had been calm. No storms had passed through the area. The ship's structure was sound. Its propeller and rudder were functional. There was no evidence of a collision. Search teams extended their grid, looking for life rafts, buoys, or any sign of the missing crew. Nothing surfaced. The ocean offered no trace. The ship had continued under autopilot for nearly a week before drifting into view. Attention turned to the possibility of foul play. With the vessel largely intact and nothing stolen, piracy seemed unlikely. The absence of damage made a hijacking improbable. But the disappearance of the crew suggested that something had happened after the last log entry and before the vessel was found. Authorities began to interview family members of the missing sailors. The captain's relatives confirmed he had no history of illness. He was not known to be suicidal. Crew members were mostly young and had no known conflicts with one another. No one on board had a criminal record. The investigation expanded to include port workers, company representatives, and other ships that had been in the area. Then, in mid-February, more than a month after the vessel was found, a break came. Indonesian police arrested a 22-year-old man in North Sulawesi who was believed to have served as a crew member on the High Aim 6. He had returned home abruptly in early January, shortly after the disappearance. He was identified as Anang, and under questioning, he made a partial confession. According to Anang, there had been a mutiny on board. He claimed that several Indonesian crew members had grown dissatisfied with their treatment. They resented the captain and engineer. On the night of December 30th, Anang said the crew had overpowered the officers while they were asleep. He did not elaborate on how they were killed. He claimed the bodies were dumped into the sea. Afterward, the remaining crew fled using one of the ship's lifeboats, steering toward Indonesian waters. No other crew members were ever found. Authorities believed that the others may have gone into hiding in small coastal towns or islands in the region. But despite efforts, no additional arrests were made. The bodies of the captain and engineer were never recovered. Their disappearance, confirmed only by a single account, was left unresolved. The High Aim 6 was eventually towed to port and examined. The lifeboat mentioned by Anang was indeed missing. DNA samples confirmed that the vessel had been occupied by multiple individuals, matching profiles from family submissions. But without more witnesses, the mutiny theory remained speculative. Anang's account lacked detail. He refused to name accomplices. He did not explain why the crew abandoned a functioning ship and chose to flee without supplies or money. Several maritime analysts proposed alternate possibilities. One theory suggested a breakdown in communication or panic after an accident. Another proposed that a fight had erupted over pay or conditions. Others pointed out that desertion was not uncommon among underpaid fishing crews. But none of these theories explained why the ship had been left running, fully operational, with no effort to disable it. The case remained open for years. The High Aim 6 became known as one of the most well-documented modern ghost ships. It was not centuries old, it was not a myth. It was a functioning vessel that appeared in calm waters, intact, and without a trace of its crew. Eventually, the ship was returned to its owners. The vessel was reportedly refurbished and put back into service, though under a different name. Its history remained, but its records were changed. Maritime databases listed it as active, with a new registry and route. No further incidents were reported. To this day, the story of the High Aim 6 is taught in maritime security courses. It is referenced in discussions about crew conditions, ship tracking, and the challenges of jurisdiction on the open sea. It is often used as a case study not of supernatural mystery but of silence. A ship found, with its engine running. A logbook ending in routine. A crew that disappeared between one line of coordinates and the next. The ship did not sink. It did not burn. It did not call for help. It simply kept moving forward, as though nothing had happened. And when it was found, it told no story. Only the absence of people. Only the faint echo of motion. Only stillness on deck, with all systems normal except for the missing hands that once ran them.